2015. And to introduce our very special guest today, I just wanted to say that Agnieszka is a renowned feminist, author, professor, and her book, a recent book, A Mother, A Feminist, if you agree with this translation, has been a unquestionable bestseller last year, a book grappling with themes of motherhood, feminism, politics, and parenting in modern Poland, which hasn't been covered that thoroughly from the left before, if I might say. And without further taking your time, I give you Agnieszka once again. Have a nice time. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm very chuffed to see so many people. I hope it's not, I hope it's me and not gender that attracts you. This was a joke. I know it's gender because when I teach other stuff, nobody shows up. I will be using the word gender today in 3 different meanings. The first meaning is what most of you probably recognize from sociology, cultural studies. Gender as opposed to sex, gender as the cultural organization of identity centered around generally conceived femininity, masculinity, and sometimes touching on sexuality, but separate from it. In other words, when I use the word gender in the gender studies sense, I differentiate it from sexual orientation on the one hand, and the physiology of the sexes on the other hand. Gender is the cultural aspect, as most people know. The other meaning of the word gender is much more sexy. You can see its first incarnation here. It is the whole debate around so-called gender ideology, which became a huge media phenomenon in the year 2013 and 14. And it was so intense that the Polish organization of linguists actually named the word gender Word of the Year 2013. And thankfully we are past that stage. We do not have gender in the headlines so much. But I think it's useful to recall that we did, and I have a whole box of this stuff, but I also have a mess in my room, so I couldn't find everything. But here are just 2 rather extreme examples. Here's a very popular journal. I'm sure many of you read it regularly. It's called The Exorcist. It really is a popular journal of Orthodox Catholics in Poland. It's about exorcisms, the devil, and the dangers that the devil in Poland spreads. And one of those dangers is gender, right? Not as understood in social studies, but as understood by the Catholic Church. And we will try to unravel what is that understanding, where it's coming from, and what does it mean for Polish gender studies scholars. It's really phenomenal. We spent the last 20 years trying to explain gender to the ordinary person, and they didn't get it. And then in 1 year, it became Word of the Year. Everybody talks about gender in Poland. So for better or worse, the Catholic Church achieved this enormous mainstreaming of the word gender. Well, here's the other extreme. I guess it's an extreme as far as the mainstream is concerned, Gazeta Wyborcza, which actually published a whole extra on gender. It says the gender revolution is coming. It has, I'm not sure why it has Superman on the cover. Oh, I guess it's because of Superman with curly hair. And this is, of course, a response to the Orthodox Catholic attack on gender. Now, I think both these phenomena are actually worthy of study. In other words, on one hand, the extremely earnest, serious attacks against what is believed to be gender ideology. I'm among the few people who work in this topic, and I've really examined quite a few of these publications, who believes that this is serious. I really believe that the people attacking gender ideology believe that such a thing exists. I happen to know it doesn't, but that really is not the point. The point is they believe it. They believe it to the point that they write big fat books about it. A woman called Marzena Nykiel wrote a book called The Trap of Gender, The War of Civilizations. This is a minor industry on the nationalist right in Poland. This is a very intelligent woman. I'm telling you, she could write a good book about an interesting subject. She happened to write an absurd book about a subject that doesn't exist, but it's still a really cool book. It's a weird mixture of misconceptions, myths, and political arguments that are really about something else than gender. They're interesting arguments. They're just not about gender. So, and my point is not to tell you why these people are wrong. I think it's pretty clear after 5 minutes why this is a misconception. The real question is, where is this coming from? Why do they believe this is true, right? And also, I'm fascinated by because I'm a cultural studies scholar and I work in film and popular culture, I'm fascinated by the iconography of war on gender. And this is one of the more absurd examples, right? Where is this coming from? Anyone? Has anyone seen it? Knows where it's coming from? This is one of about 20 stickers that were produced by a website making fun of the people who are battling gender and sort of satirizing their misconceptions. So here you have a mix between a rabbit and a tiger, which is, I guess, a funny or not funny, I found it funny at some point, a funny spoof on the way that gender is demonized by the right in Poland. Okay, so this is one, and there are lots of weird mixes like this. But actually, this is one of my favorites, and I guess I might use this occasion to organize it, to advertise here. A bag produced by Krytyka Polityczna with Lord Gender on it. You also see Lord Gender on the cover of the book on gender, which is, by the way, really good. I can see some Polish faces here, so if you haven't read it yet, read it. Lots of good articles on social theory and so on, as well as on the right-wing attack on gender. There will be more of those. There's also a fascinating example of popular theater, including gender, namely the popular cabaret called Pożar w burdelu, Fire in the Bordello. Anyone knows it? Is anyone here who's been to a Fire in the Bordello show? One person to okay, this is a cult phenomenon in Poland. You guys are really not from Poland, right? You really don't speak. Okay, good. I will really tell you the basic stuff. Anyway, this is a really cool cabaret. Leftist, feminist, weird, really good music. Anyway, when this was just starting, when nobody knew what this was all about, they had a sketch in which a guy in a dress, hairy legs, satin dress, beard, a blonde wig, danced a very weird, seductive dance, singing "Danger." Gender stands for danger. The only difference is one letter. And I thought that was really the best bit of kind of popular cultural lore about gender. There are lots of jokes about gender. There are lots of cartoons. There was a point last spring, and I was giving a big lecture on the folklore of gender in Poland, where I had hundreds of stuff to pick from. Like I had a problem downloading it all. It was amazing. All Polish newspapers had cartoons on gender, for instance. And now we have a gender movie. I haven't seen it yet, but if you can see it, if you can understand Polish or maybe get it with English subtitles, it's kind of the cult work of Polish backlash, Zanussi Ciało Obce. It's a film in which some crazy feminists with whips are basically persecuting an innocent Catholic, and apparently it's wonderful. It's really campy, except it's serious. And this is another aspect of the war on gender, is that it is unbelievably funny if you think it's funny, or it's unbelievably serious if you think it's serious. And in a way, it's both. And of course, the culture of the funny, serious stuff, or as Susan Sontag famously said, failed seriousness, is also known as, anyone? Camp. So this stuff is camp. Like if I knew there would be so many of you, I would have a boa here, but it's kind of can't look. Okay, so before we get to the war on gender and where it's coming from, I want to say a few general things about gender in the first meaning. In other words, the social organization of relations between men and women in this country. There is a broader pattern that many scholars of gender in Eastern Europe have discussed in many books of gender in the transition period, in the post-1989 period. This pattern is referred to as retraditionalization, which has several aspects. One is economic and political. After 1989, women were systematically pushed out of places where there is money and power. They were politically marginalized. And in some countries, especially former Yugoslavia, women who dared to talk about equality were also scapegoated and even threatened. It was not fun to be a feminist in the 1990s in Eastern Europe. Now, I have nice people coming to listen to my lectures. I'm even going to get paid for it. In the 90s, no. We were really considered weird. We were considered underground. We were also considered man-like and un-Eastern European. We were seen as foreigners. The public sphere was masculinized and it was more or less taken for granted. I think less so today. I think there is much more open talk about gender inequality. It's a subject that polarizes people, but it's not a subject that freaks people out. In the 90s, it was really considered very odd to call yourself a feminist. This was partly, scholars have argued that it is very simply linked to the rise of nationalism in the region. That this has happened all over the place. Whenever there's a rise of nationalism in a country or region, feminism is the first ideology to go, right? It's the ideology that is most antagonistic to nationalism. Women in the region, this argument is usually used by foreigners. American and British sociologists study the region, make the link to nationalism very quickly. In Eastern Europe, we had a longer memory of the specific discourses in the region, and we like to argue, and I still believe this argument is really relevant, that nationalism came a little later. That it wasn't until the mid-90s that it was clear that we had strong nationalist movements in this region, and resistance to gender was earlier. In fact, it was here in the 80s. It was part of the anti-communist discourse. The most famous example of this, for those of you who don't know any Polish popular culture, is Seksmisja. Has anyone seen this movie? You must see this movie. You do not understand Polish culture if you do not see Seksmisja. It's like the worst and best movie made in this country, from a feminist perspective. It's also a really good comedy. It's a comedy in which a bunch of men are kidnapped and tortured by a bunch of feminists. And it's basically, well, they're not kidnapped, they kind of go there of their own free will, but anyway, they are tortured. The feminists want to keep it, to naturalize them in the land of women, in other words, cut off their penises. The men resist, and so on. It's almost wonderful. The feminists claim that Copernicus was a woman, and this is a movie that gets played on Polish television every Christmas. It's kind of like, are any Americans in the room? It's kind of like It's a Wonderful Life. Right? It's our version. Like, everybody knows it. Everybody uses quotes from it. Now, why am I telling you this weird story? Because in Poland in the 1980s, I think it's 84 when this film was made, it was completely clear to everybody that this is a metaphor. That this is not a film about crazy feminists and hapless men whose penises are in danger. This is a film about communists who on the screen are portrayed as crazy feminists, and members of the opposition, who on the screen are portrayed as men threatened by castration. Now, why was it clear to everyone? Because in this region, there is a long history of communist discourse appropriating equality discourse. They simply did it, right? Lenin, Stalin, all those people like to talk about the equality of the sexes. They didn't do it, they didn't introduce it. There was no equality of the sexes under communism, although there were certain provisions for women which are now dearly missed, and it's an interesting debate in Poland. And do we want to talk about the stuff that was good about that period? But that's not the point. The point is, the moment you said in the 80s that you were a feminist, that was immediately labeled as communist, and Seksmisja was not to blame for this. Seksmisja is just a very popular example of this kind of discourse, which was in the air. Now, to put things on the ground a little bit, before I get back to cool images, I could give you a long lecture about the various debates on gender during the last 25 years. I suspect this is not why you're here, so I will be brief. There are, I believe, three main topics, or three main areas, maybe four. I'm changing this presentation. Yeah, it's four actually today. Yesterday it was three. Okay, so the first big area of debate, of course, is reproductive rights. And I'm not going to show you the film today because I'm kind of narcissistic, so when there's so many people listening, I like to talk. But if you want to see the movie, we will do a separate screening of the Underground Women's, it's called Underground Women's State. It's a really good documentary on It's a few years old now, but it's still very much up to date on what happens to Poland when a woman gets pregnant and doesn't want to have the baby. She doesn't have the baby, but she doesn't have an abortion, a legal abortion either. But it's also not an underground abortion in the sense that Americans of the older generation would remember it. It's not a back alley abortion. There is a thriving abortion underground in Poland. The price is around the average salary in Poland. In other words, and maybe someone has the most recent data here, I would guess about 3,000–4,000 zlotys you get an abortion. A safe, easy, illegal abortion. It's deeply humiliating, but it won't kill you. The result is that very few women are actually involved in fighting for legal abortion, because it's easier to get one than to change the law, right? But the law is one of the most repressive in Europe. Along with Malta and Ireland, Poland has an almost total ban on abortion. There are 3 exceptions. The ban has been in existence since '93. The 3 exceptions are if it's a danger to the woman's life or health, fetal damage, rape, incest. Now, all those 3 exceptions to the ban are actually not real reasons to get an abortion. In other words, if it's a threat to your life or health, they will tell you it's not a bad enough threat. The famous case of Alicja Tysiąc, who was in danger of losing her eyesight and ended up in Strasbourg, is an example. If it's fetal damage, they will tell you it's the wrong fetal damage, or they are not sure yet. And anyway, you wouldn't know, because in Poland, prenatal testing is unavailable. And in fact, some hospitals have announced in recent years that it is immoral and they won't give it. If it's rape or incest, again, they will keep the procedures going on long enough that it becomes too late for you to have an abortion. But in fact, you won't even try. The number of legal abortions in Poland is about 500. The number per year. The number of illegal abortion is about 200,000. So it really doesn't matter if you are one of those cases, because nobody believes in the availability of abortion anyway, right? And a number of tragedies that I could go on about have resulted from this, but not a mass movement. And the film, The Underground Women's World, Women's State, is an answer to the question why. It's a long answer. It has to do with the role of the Polish church in Poland. It has to do with conformity of Poland. It has to do with shaming, with the fact that this is still a very repressive country in terms of sexuality. It is not. This is, of course, my opinion. Many of you might disagree. It's not because most Polish people are pro-lifers in the way that you would say Americans are pro-lifers. Americans who fight against abortion have a different mindset, I would say, from the Polish version. The Polish version has a much more openly repressive tone to it, I would say. It's really about keeping women in their place, not about saving unborn babies. Although, of course, if you ask them directly, they will tell you it's all about unborn babies. And this is a huge area of concern, I would say despair for Polish women's movement. One of the major narratives of the Polish women's movement is that we were, that in the early 90s, it was made clear who was in power here when the Polish feminist movement, what is now the feminist movement, what was then the pro-referendum movement, collected almost 2 million signatures in favor of a referendum, and the referendum did not happen, because the church said you can't vote on matters of life and death. And so this is not just a moment of history of abortion in Poland, it's a moment in the history of Polish democracy. Early in the period of transition, Polish citizens were informed where democracy ends. Well, democracy ends when the church says that's it, right? And I think that this is a very important moment historically. Women are a marker of boundaries, gender studies scholars will tell you. So this is a huge area which is certainly very much connected to the war on gender. One of the themes of people who argue against gender ideology is that gender ideology is a plot of the United Nations and other international organizations whose aim is to make people sterile. The purpose of gender ideology is to make people sterile, so that babies will not be born. So it's to sell their contraception, it's to make them infertile by waiting too long to get pregnant, it's by sterilizing them. There's this idea that there's money in this, that sexual education, contraception, IVF treatment, that all these things were really invented by these very rich Westerners in New York, so that poor people, brown people, Polish people, traditionalist people, family-oriented people, and I do mean brown. There's a very interesting post-colonial note in this. There's a whole chapter about colonialism of gender in this really weird book. Now, what's really moving is they believe it. They really believe that the World Health Organization wants to destroy the human population. Right? And they've got really weird figures for that. So reproductive rights are at the center, and in fact, the Vatican, there are many trajectories, there are many efforts to uncover when it really started. I actually believe that the war on gender started in '95, after the Beijing conference. There are documents from various conferences in Vatican and surrounding sort of bodies that later evolved into the European pro-life movement, and they very strongly attacked the word gender. They were, at that point, they were saying, they were not attacking feminism, which would be the natural thing to do, right? They were not attacking abortion, although they were attacking abortion, but they were using the word gender in this kind of demonizing way. They were saying, we have to stop this word from being used by the international community. And since then, there has been a persistent effort of Christian as well as Muslim fundamentalists on the UN forum to stop the word gender and everything that comes with it from being used. We are now going through a stage of this process that has to do with the anti-violence Istanbul Convention, right? You probably followed this in the media, but it started much earlier, and I think they are now focusing for reasons that are sort of much more complicated on violence, but it started with reproductive rights. The second huge area of interest is, of course, the rights of sexual minorities. And as you probably know, Poland has a big parade, which used to be called the Equality Parade. I wonder if it still is. Is it still Parada Równości? Help me here. It is. Okay. It's not emphatically not called the Love Parade. And I'm not saying this to be critical. I would love it to be called the Love Parade, but it's not. But if you follow the way it is covered by conservatives, you would think it is. In other words, the Polish sexual minorities have taken a very, I would say, carefully balanced and some would say shy tactic of let us exist, we are just like you, we want to start happy families, but no children, thank you. Now they're talking more, I think, openly about adoption, but it's a very, very human rights-oriented movement, which talks about equality. To the Catholic Church, this is, of course, an ideological issue. They don't believe that what is at stake is equality. What they say is that it's about the destruction of the family. Interestingly, the war on gender did not go in that direction in Poland. In Poland, the war on gender focused around sex change, which is very odd because there is no sex change in Poland. No, you can't get a sex change operation on the national health care. So it was a kind of man in the dress, phantasmatic idea, and violence against women. The Istanbul Convention was the issue. But in France, the war on gender, the mobilization of La Manif pour tous, for instance. Any French people here? Who are you guys? Okay, Belgium, Germany. Oh, Germany, cool. Russia. Okay, other countries. Ukraine, all right. I will make some remarks about Germany because Germany is really interesting to Polish gender issues. Like Polish people believe that German women are really men in drag. If you were to go by Polish popular culture, there's a lot of this. If you women, if you go any further with this feminism business, you'll be like those German women. German sounds like gender, so it's in terms of national gender stereotyping, Germany is high on the agenda. I used to follow that stuff. Okay, so sexual minority rights, obviously, a second huge area. And in this regard, the campaign against gender really relies on the confusion, or maybe even conflation, between gender, identity, and the whole set of issues that have to do with equality of men and women, like reproductive rights and violence and so on the one hand, and sexual orientation. They're basically saying it's all the same. And the purpose of it is to, what is the purpose? What's the purpose of the gender ideology? What's the threat? What's the ultimate threat? Turning little boys into little girls. This is what those gender people do, according to the gender crusaders. So it's a very interesting mix where you are evoking homophobia and misogyny, but the ultimate threat, and I'll talk more about this, is that they want to do something to your children. And some evil, perverse person who wants to do something to your child in a Catholic country, it sounds a lot like a pedophile priest, doesn't it? No. No, it's a transsexual, probably from Germany, who is spreading the evil of sexual education in Polish preschools in order to put little boys into dresses. My son really loves this, because of course my son loves Darth Vader. And he's just like, why is Darth Vader wearing a dress? My son is really confused. But this is the ultimate image, a little boy in a dress. Right? And you know it's a little boy because he's wearing a Darth Vader mask. Okay, enough joking. The fourth issue, and I will go to the third one in a moment because it's the one I really care about, is electoral quotas, women in politics. Before the gender hell broke loose, this was the most successful campaign of Polish feminism. Like it or not, this is the only thing that Polish feminism ever achieved. I'm sorry to tell you, we're not very successful. Abortion, forget it. Violence against women, not much. Anti-discrimination stuff, yes, it's in the law, but it's not thanks to us. It's really the European Union that did it. The one thing we achieved is the quotas. It was supposed to be 50-50, that was what we campaigned for. In the end, the quota that was won was 35%, and it's really happening. There are women candidates all over the place. You can see women active in electoral politics. You can see people talking in the media about the gender gap. I think the Polish consciousness has been raised in regards to women in power, women's access to electoral politics. How far that takes you is really a matter of opinion. But it was certainly a very successful campaign, the only one that really hit the mainstream, and the only one in which feminism really managed to change people's minds. When the campaign started, everybody was saying, no, quotas humiliate women, nobody would want to be on the list. And then, you know, a year later, everybody's for quotas. And it's obvious that they are the right way to go. And now it turns out they don't really work. Because of course there are women on the lists, on the electoral lists in elections, but they just happen to be placed on places on the lists that don't get you elected. Which is, by the way, exactly what happened in France. Right? In France, electoral quotas were instituted and they failed as a tool. But I would say as an educational moment, 2009, 2010, Congress of Women, largest women's organization in Poland, very successful. Now, these are all issues that are very ideologically loaded, that have to do with identity, that have to do with power. The one issue that doesn't get debated so much, and certainly doesn't get so much attention, is one that really crosses ideological boundaries, and that's the one where that I tried to deal with in my book, in my Mother Feminist book, is the place of gender in Polish policy. Not politics as in who is in power, but politics as in where do our tax zlotys go? Right? And our tax zlotys go to building the National Stadium, really cool, isn't it? Like big. My son says, this is mine. But you know what? My son goes to a private preschool. And it's not because I'm rich, it's because we didn't go and get into a public one, like a lot of families in Warsaw. Poland has a catastrophic situation in childcare. We have the lowest ratio of little kids in creches. I think it's now stupendously risen from 2 to 5%. In France, it's like 90%, okay? The number of women of childbearing age who have full employment is about 20%. Not because they want to stay home. It's because you can't get a job if you are a woman of a childbearing age. You might get a contract for 2 months, but then if you get pregnant, forget it, right? We also have the largest level in Europe of people who do not have permanent employment. And these people are mostly young. And so most women who would like to have a baby can't have a baby. And if they don't want to have a baby, well, they can't do that either because abortion is illegal, right? So basically the whole issue of motherhood, but also of healthcare, elderly care, all those issues that are really central to well-being and equality, because care is what women do, like when they're not attending feminist events. Care is what really takes women away from all this other stuff, like money, power, right? This is what we do. We do it, I think the statistics are about 40 hours per week to men's 5 hours a week. Right? So this is a very traditional country in terms of division of labor. It's also a very traditional country in terms of redistribution of public funds. And so we have this horrible situation where the traditional role of women coincides with a ruthless neoliberal agenda. And so women, and this is very well described by sociologists like Elżbieta Karolczuk, who have been working on the issue of motherhood in Poland right now, women are under double pressure. And it's a very contradictory situation. On one hand, you have your very traditionalist family and your parish church, and everyone around you telling you that your role is to be a mother and a caregiver and a great cook and a wonderful lover. And, you know, there are all these jokes about how a woman must be a wonderful cook in the kitchen and a prostitute in bed and a saint in church. You know, all this stuff about, you know, how to be a real woman, which of course means you can't have a job because you wouldn't have time to do it. And on the other hand, you have the market economy telling you, bitch, go to work. Like, what are you doing here? Like wasting our tax dollars on your you know, when you're like sitting at home, right? There's misogyny from both sides. There's the traditional version of misogyny and there's the modern neoliberal version. Women are really pissed off, and which is not to say they're feminists. There are lots of studies that basically show huge dissatisfaction of especially young Polish women with the way this country works. Now, how do they show it, aside from telling to pollsters? They leave. We have a huge number of especially young women emigrating to countries like Great Britain, Germany, and so on. And guess what they do when they get there? They get pregnant and they have babies. Polish women have huge fertility rates in Britain. Poland has the lowest fertility rate in Europe right now, along with, I think, I don't want to lie because it keeps changing, but I think it's, I think we're like the third from the bottom. And it's way, way, way beyond replacement of generations. So when in Poland, women don't have babies, restricting abortion is not changing this. What is really going on here is that these cultural issues are replacing the debate that was really, really needed, and it is a debate about social policy. Right? But this is a very difficult and expensive debate. I recently read that France devotes about 5% of its gross national product to social policy, which is a combination of pro-family and pro-equality policies, which is really the same thing if you are a modern country like France. In Poland, these things seem to be completely opposite, right? Because we have the gender war raging, but that's where the 5% of their taxes go. Guess what it is in Poland? It's about 1%. And so I don't want to get into the details. Each of these issues, you know, could be the subject of a lecture, but there were very heated and frustrating debates about women's early retirement. Women want to retire early in Poland. Feminists were telling them, don't retire early because you won't have enough money. But they were saying, but we want to take care of our grandchildren. And feminists were saying, I'm talking about 90s debates. I was part of these debates and I'm not really ashamed of it. They were saying, and feminists were saying, now, don't be brainwashed by patriarchy. You don't really want to take care of your grandchildren. You really want to work, right? Then if you look at the factories where these women are working, I wouldn't want to work there either, frankly. And then finally, when you look at what these women's real options are, which is that there are no jobs, then you really understand why they want the early retirement. But in the meantime, our retirement system changed so that it really matters how long you work. And so early retirement weirdly seems like a privilege to most Polish women. Well, if you do your math, you realize that it's not a privilege. It's a ticket to the poorhouse, right? So there are these really interesting, from a sociological point of view, issues that where traditional values and and also habits carried from the former system clash with the neoliberal reality of, and also cynicism of Polish social policy, or in fact lack thereof. And so what I'm suggesting, I don't want to really say it, but I'm suggesting it, is that all this stuff about gender, electoral politics, even abortion, because in the end, if you want it, you just get it, right? That all this stuff is instead of the real debate we should be having here, right? Which is really about economics, which is really about priorities, which is really about redistribution. And we are having these heavy-handed cultural debates because we're nowhere close to dealing with the real issue. Okay, so now that I've told you what the real issue is, I will go to the fake issue, which is why you're all here, because you want to hear about the man in the dress. So I want to give you a few images to help you understand the sources of gender conservatism in Poland. Image number 1, baba na traktorze. Now, yeah, it's funny, huh? There's actually a documentary film made by a Polish feminist about the woman who originally posed for this poster. Really wonderful woman, like, serious farmer woman, really, proud that she was on this poster. It's a wonderful poster also, if you like an expert in posters. But anyway, this poster and this idea of a woman on a tractor and what it supposedly does to her reproductive system, and I don't know if it's true, nobody cares. So this became a central myth, or a kind of organizing image of this stereotype in Poland, but it's a self-reproducing, self-fulfilling prophecy that feminism is a Soviet invention which was transplanted into Poland against our will. So in a way, because of this, and I'm really using shortcuts here, I'll be happy to explain later, because of the power of this image, of the way that it has been ridiculed by anti-communist opposition and so on, right? But we are dealing with a very strong association between communism and feminism in Poland, which is very difficult to break through. Sex misja is another version of this, right? Sociologist Professor Fuszara, who is now Poland's plenipotentiary for equal treatment, wrote once an article years ago, which I really like to give to students, about the fake or forced emancipation under communism. This is a paradox. Women got a lot of the stuff in Eastern Europe that Western women were fighting for. They got it from the wrong source. They got it from the source that also was oppressing their country, that was putting their husbands in prisons for political reasons and so on, right? And so if you are force-fed things like free childcare, decent healthcare, gender equality in various symbolic areas, you're going to hate it, right? You're going to think that the good thing to be as a woman is a conservative. And this, I think, this is still working. This idea that somehow gender equality is not Polish and that it is somehow not democratic. Well, here's another image that might ring a bell. Virgin Mary, and specifically the Virgin Mary of Częstochowa, which is the most reproduced and powerful and also quite beautiful image in Poland. Now, Virgin Mary is not just the mother of Christ in Poland. She is, I think, more than the mother of Christ in the Polish popular imagination. She is the Queen of Poland. And I was once intrigued by the fact that the Virgin Mary is repeatedly crowned as the Queen of Poland, but Jesus Christ somehow doesn't get to be king. And I'm serious, this is like weird. Why not? There was an attempt, and I don't remember the year, I think it was 2006 or 2007, when some very conservative Polish nationalist politicians tried to create this new ritual and to pass through parliament this idea that Christ is the King of Poland. Guess what happened? The bishops said, no way. The bishops, the Catholic Church said, no, that's taking it too far. So why am I saying this? It's not just a joke. It's a very interesting moment when you can see that the link between Catholicism, politicized religion in Poland, or first before it's even politicized, the link between Catholic religion, Catholic tradition, and national identity in Poland is a heavily gendered link. The symbol of this link is not Jesus. The symbol of this link is again and again and again the Virgin Mary, Queen of Poland. If it has a male symbol, it's Cardinal Wyszyński, but he's not a deity. He might get to be one, but not yet. Okay, and he's the guy who he was the archbishop that gave Poland repeatedly to Virgin Mary. The original moment when Virgin Mary was crowned as the Queen of Poland is 1656. King Jan Kazimierz made his vows in Lviv during the war with Sweden. Those Swedes, now they want to impose equality on us, right? So anyway, Potop Szwedzki, the so-called flood, really horrible war, by the way. And there's a huge mythology about miracles that accompanied this event. I don't want to get into this. The point is, Częstochowa Sanctuary is the key cult place in Poland, and it is very feminized, right? It is associated not with Christ. Christ doesn't matter here, it's kind of blankish, but this particularly national image of, national and religious image. Here's another sacrosanct image that links womanhood to Poland. And this is one of hundreds of such images. There were several expositions in Poland in recent years it's really fascinating. Poland repeatedly gets portrayed in Polish paintings as a woman. Not just any woman, because that would be kind of trite. Like, you know, the French have Madeleine, the British have Britannia, the Russian have Mother Russia. Well, that's all cool. Every country has its woman embodiment of the nation. But Poland is special. You know how every country thinks it's special? Well, we're really, really special. The Jews, forget it. We're really special guys. Okay, so here's why we're special. Because our woman, our symbol, she suffers the most. Like, she really suffers. She suffers so bad. Here she suffers by being enchained by, of course, in the process of partitions. Jan Matejko is probably the most famous Polish patriotic painter here, 1863, the January Uprising. I hope you're reading up your Polish history. Here's how she suffers. This is my favorite. And really, there are hundreds of such images. She's crucified. The idea that Poland is a Christ of the nations is one of the most weird and powerful ideas. What I find fascinating that even when she, Poland, gets to be Christ, she's still a she, right? The image is feminized. And this is really important, that Poland is a woman. She's a woman, Maria Janion claims. Oops, I think I forgot to bring in, I didn't give you my favorite images here. There's a whole series of Brodger paintings in which Poland is a woman who looks half dead, but she's in fact so deadish that she looks like death. And Maria Janion, who is Poland's most significant intellectual today, I dare say, has argued quite convincingly that Polish patriotic traditions has a lot of necrophilia in it. That there's this idea that to be a patriot is to die repeatedly in the service of Poland, who has died repeatedly for our sake so that we can die some more. Now, this is a kind of pastiche, but if you read Polish patriotic poetry, it's kind of scary. Like, it's all about death. You read American patriotic poetry, it's about victory. Russian, like, you know, it's about stepping on people's heads. I'm sure the Ukrainians know something about this. Poland, we're dying, we want to die some more. And, you know, this is fascinating because the person who's making us die and then die some more, and she wants us to give her the corpses of our babies. There's a lot of that too, like dead babies and Polish necrophiliac patriotic poetry. Those babies are grown up, by the way. They're soldiers who are repeatedly dying. So this person is a kind of conglomerate of powerful symbols. She is Poland, Polonia. She is also weirdly connected to Virgin Mary. Virgin Mary, the Queen, and Polonia, they merge into one in a lot of this poetry and these images too. So we love Virgin Mary so much, but that we constantly are sort of putting our lives in her, you know, at her feet. She is also the Polish mother, Matka Polka, the most famous poem, expression of Polish patriotism that some people know by heart, I do not, is Adam Mickiewicz's Matka Polka. Right? And okay, here's a fragment from Maria Janion's original formulation. This later evolved into a book, which is really interesting, Niesamowita Słowiańszczyzna, but She originally wrote an article for Gazeta Wyborcza, which was reprinted and quoted, and it's really fascinating. It's called Farewell to Poland. I think it appeared as a whole text in Baltic Worlds, an academic journal. You can probably find it on the web. Poland has been represented as an allegory, symbol, myth. The motherland's body was usually a body filled with suffering, pain, misery, a body in chains, in stocks, pushed into an open grave, even crucified. She has died before our eyes, she, Poland, but we know she would be resurrected. She sent her sons to their death in the name of this resurrection, and they went willingly. Dressed in dark flowing robes, this mother, Poland is a mother. She is a mother of men, emphatically. You don't get to be her daughter, ladies. But anyway, if you're her son, you're gonna die. So that's no fun either. So, dressed in dark flowing robes, this mother in deep mourning awakened in us dread, fear, and terror, but also a sense of pity, a quivering, fearful sort of love. I hope my translation does justice to this, but it's a really wonderful poetic text in its own right. The point is that we are all, we patriotic Poles, we are under a constant pressure of delivering our suffering to Poland, who is constantly suffering. She's constantly being betrayed, and you can never do enough for her. And her enemies are all around. So if you're following some of the crazy debates in Poland about, that keep coming up when peace has a new statement to make, there is a kind of unconscious, there's unconscious material behind it that is really, that has been psychoanalyzed. And I'm not an expert on public psychoanalysis. What I want to suggest is that we don't have it easy in Poland. In other words, if you happen to be a real woman who happens to want some real rights, in a country that has this to say about women at a deep unconscious level, or this to say about its own identity, right? You're in trouble, right? This is not a liberal democracy. It is a liberal democracy in terms of how the laws are written, but in terms of how people's minds, people's unconscious imagination is organized. These women, they're weird. They're saying, we want our rights, we want equality now. Now, the Polish women's movement has several embodiments, one of which is the Manifest, and I can see some faces of people who are involved in organizing the Manifest. I was one of the founders in the year 2000. It's still been going strong. So if you're in Warsaw in March, probably around the 8th of March, there will be another Manifest. But there's a sense of excitement and beleaguerment about going out in the streets, demonstrating for women's rights in Poland. There is a sense in which this is really revolutionary, because Poland, at heart, as a kind of culture, as a cultural tradition, is about making this impossible. Maybe exaggerating a little bit, but I've always had this sense of incredible excitement and wonder when it happens, when they're really angry women who are saying, no, we count. We are human beings who deserve our rights. We're not going to be locked in this symbolism of Virgin Mary, Polonia, all this, this highfalutin stuff. The other embodiment of the women's movement is much more mainstream and much less radical, is the Congress of Women, which has been in progress since 2009. Okay, and I won't get into the details here. I've talked about them a little bit. They got the quotas in. Now, in this context, and how much time have I got here? Okay, I'm going to talk for another 15 minutes maybe, and then open up for discussion. In this context, we get the gender war, 2013 through 2014. And most people in Poland at the time thought that it was invented in Poland and that the Vatican didn't know anything about it. This was the biggest misconception. The Vatican knew. In fact, the Vatican had done it before, but it took us a while to realize it. So I'm going to reconstruct it the way it went on at the time. The first phase, mobilization on the right and confusion on the liberal side, starts in the summer of 2013 when Bishop Tadeusz Pieronek, who by the way is a liberal bishop by Polish standards, it really gets much worse. He's the guy that Sławek Sierakowski, the leader of this place, occasionally talks with. And in fact, it is Sławek Sierakowski who used this quote, but it's a real quote, like he didn't invent it, because Bishop Kieronek said it in a debate with Sławek Sierakowski in Karuzela Kultury, which is like a big open-air festival for intellectuals and artists and so on. And it was happening, I think, on the seaside in 2013. So what did he say? He said, just on the side, as an aside to another topic, and I would also like to add that gender ideology is worse than communism and Nazism put together. And Sławek went like, what? And it was just the beginning. Okay, so what happens later? Then we suddenly get this flood of posters all around Poland, which are warning parents. And, parents need to be warned. Like, there's lice in preschools occasionally. Like, there's violence, there's cigarettes. One boy hits another boy. Well, now there's this new danger that, dear parents, you need to be concerned about. Protect your children from gender. Okay, so parents were alerted. What is this gender? They've never heard the word before. October 2013, there's a sequence of pseudo-debates. I thought at the time there were debates, and so I actually allowed myself to be invited to one of them. Organized in churches, organized in episcopate. The one I went to was in a Dominican church. The Dominican church in Warsaw is a really nice place. Like, they do stuff for kids and mothers, and I used to go there because they had good food, and it was nice. And they're really nice priests. Like, they give good advice to divorcing couples, and they have a reputation for tolerance. And so they invite me and two other women from kind of liberal Catholic journals. And we're talking, we're exchanging definitions of gender. And they say, we don't really like Judith Butler because she's too radical. And I say, well, I don't like her either because she writes in bad English prose. And, and then this guy comes in from the outside, and he has this big sign that says gender 666. And I'm thinking, this is interesting. What is this 66 thing? And I didn't know. And then he turns around the sign, and it says gender is the devil. Oh, now I know. Okay. And then he sits down, and I'm thinking this is going to be an interesting debate, except then he throws a bomb. And then it wasn't so fun, especially because my son and a number of other kids were, playing with some priest in the background. Anyway, my son is fine. The guy was finally shoved out. Most people returned after a moment, but that was when I realized this is scary. Like, there are fanatics out there who think I'm the devil, and that means they're probably going to want to kill me rather than debate me, right? And this was what made me a little worried is that this fact of the bomb being thrown was mostly hushed by the liberal media, as if they didn't want to provoke more violence. That's always dangerous when there's violence, but liberals are pretending there's no violence because they are preventing violence that way. Like, I've heard this before. It was about Jews, right? Whereas the radicals on the other side, the conservative radicals, were saying it was a wonderful joke, these crazy feminists, so we threw a bomb, right? And it was scary. It was pretty scary. And I didn't go to any more of those debates on the other side, but I did follow the media quite closely. The main event of the gender war was the pastoral letter of the Bishops' Conference of Poland. And you can find it on the internet, the whole thing. It's a very interesting document. It was read in Polish parishes on December 2013, December 29th, 2013, so right after Christmas, like the time when people are doing their Catholic thing and their Christmas tree thing. Gender ideology was defined as a threat to the family, and I think I have a nice quote here. Here we go. Here's a quote. The gender ideology is the product of many decades of ideological and cultural changes that are deeply rooted in Marxism and neo-Marxism, endorsed by some feminist movements and the sexual revolution. According to this ideology, humans can freely determine, this is where the boy in the dress comes in, so watch out. According to this ideology, humans can freely determine whether they want to be men or women, and freely choose their sexual orientation. We call on educational institutions to engage in the promotion of an integral vision of man. And this is the political moment when schools are in fact called upon to exclude from their ranks any teachers who might use the word gender. And this is in fact what happened. The media blitz follows in early 2014, January, February. This was the largest intensity of anti-gender events. And the two key figures of this phase were Representative Beata Kępa, very familiar name now to all Polish feminists, who in fact became the only woman, as well as the head of the parliamentary committee, which was called Stop Gender Ideology. This was like something that Polish parliament was doing, right? Was working how to stop gender ideology. January 22nd, Father Dariusz Oko lectures on gender in Polish parliament. Now, it was really quite an event, right? You have this guy talking about how gender leads to sex change, and it is worse than communism and Nazism put together. He was doing this not in a church, not in a public square, in Polish parliament. He was, of course, invited by Beata Kępa and her committee. I don't want to really quote an extenso from this, but he said things like, again, gender is worse than Nazism and communism, gender leads to sexualization of children, atheists are sex maniacs. There were several efforts to sue him for libel, by the way. But apparently you cannot sue unless the person saying horrible things names you. In other words, it's a crime to say that Agnieszka Graff is a sex maniac, which I might be, but anyway, I can also sue if someone says this about me. But if someone says feminists are sex maniacs, apparently that's legal. So lawsuits didn't happen. By the way, neither did an effort to legalize, to get a gender foundation legalized in Poland. Not a foundation, a gender association. We've been through 3 efforts to get ourselves registered. We keep getting rejected on grounds of technicalities. Here's just a small sample of posters that appeared all around Poland announcing various anti-gender events. These were lectures, as well as workshops, various training sessions, and they were organized by right-wing parties, but also by churches. This sign, by the way, this is a very famous sign, the anti-copulation sign. It is a sign that is internationally used by neo-Nazis in Eastern Europe. Scholars believe that it originates in Romania, but nobody really knows where it comes from. Last I heard it was Romania. In Poland, it is routinely used by Młodzież Wszechpolska, which is a kind of youth, extreme right youth group, and ONR, which also features on a lot of these posters. Now, the responses, and this was the time when I got involved, I started writing about this, the responses coming from the feminist side, I thought were very feeble and misguided. They were basically efforts to change the topic. In other words, Father Oko was saying gender is the threat to civilization, gender people are sex maniacs, gender leads to degeneration of civilization. And what were feminists saying? They were saying, no, it's not. Gender is really a concept in sociology, and we will explain it to you. And so it went. The effort to explain that the whole campaign was based on a misunderstanding, with careful explanations put on websites, was initiated by the plenipotentiary for women's rights at the time, Agnieszka Graff, who's a really wonderful woman politician. And I talked to her and I asked her, do you really think they don't understand? And she said, no, but it's my job to pretend so. This is like, the idea of diplomacy, like somebody says, I'm going to shoot you, and you say, but this is not a good idea because I'm really a nice person, right? Well, before they start shooting, it may be a nice conversation, but the point is they were already shooting, right? And also they were not as isolated as I think we thought at the time. So another thing that happened, and I'm actually participated in this, I believed this for a while, that the whole thing was really an effort to detract attention from sex scandals in the Catholic Church. A few months before this started, there were the first big law cases against priests were going public, including the one that was just recently taken up by the Vatican, right, with the guy in Dominicana, I think. But there were others. Suddenly it really hit the mainstream media, as it hasn't before. There were several moments when it might have, but it didn't. And also, one of the bishops, and I don't want to confuse the names here, so I won't tell you which one. I think it's Michalik, but it may be wrong, so maybe I shouldn't be saying this. Said something like, it's really the fault of divorcing parents because they don't love their children enough. And so what do the children do? They cling to their priests. And when the child clings to you, what can you do? You know, he detracted immediately. Like the media went crazy in Poland. Like this is not something, this is a country where people really care about their kids. And they really are a little suspicious about guys in dresses. And so this activated a huge outburst of anti-clerical phobia, or they would say, or I would say righteous anger. And so what Monika Płatek, for instance, said, she's a very important Polish feminist and lawyer, and she said this repeatedly in the media, and I think it was a good thing to say. It was an important, a useful thing to say, that wait a minute, you are telling us that teachers who teach gender equality are hurting the children? Well, wait a moment, look at the list of Catholic priests that have just been put under charges. Shouldn't we be talking about this? So basically, the one explanation in this early phase was that it's all to detract attention from the pedophile scandals. Great argument, it just happens to be wrong. Analytically speaking, strategically speaking, maybe right. Okay, then there was a wave of interest from various cultural circles, niches, popular journals, but also academic journals. If you look at the recent issues of Znak, Tygodnik Powszechny, Gazeta Wyborcza, all over the place. Book magazines, film magazines, they all had an issue on gender. Now I don't think it's so important. At the time I was really excited because, like nobody wanted to talk about gender when we were discovering it in the academia, and now it was all over the place. So I really focused on this sort of thing, right? This is the poor child in Exorcist, and the poor child is hiding from the danger of gender. And this was very typical imagery. Okay. And I talked about this, the ongoing effort to register the Polish Gender Association, still in progress. We're still hoping, some of us anyway. Meanwhile, gender gets chosen as the word of the year 2013, and the mobilization on the right becomes more scary, better organized, very well funded. And I don't want to name names because we don't really know who's funding it. But there are suspicions that we're talking big politics, and we're in fact talking big international politics here. That this is not an effort on the part of a few Polish politicians to destabilize Polish gender studies departments. It's an effort on the side of big supranational politicians to destabilize the region. And once I started going to conferences on the gender war in places like Hungary and and talking to people from Ukraine and Russia, I realized this is big, and it's not an accident that it's happening in Poland. So first of all, they started big websites, and they're kind of dead now. But in 2013, they were really very much alive. One that I visited regularly was called Stop Seksualizacji. The other one was Stop Gender. There were all these lectures, there were all these pickets, there were flyers with so-called facts. And the World Health Organization was clearly chosen as the target. The standards of the World Health Organizations were constantly quoted and misquoted as proof that the international human rights organizations want to teach children masturbation, basically. That was the argument, weird as it sounds. And what they were basically saying is we need sex education from early stages. But if you're teaching, if you know anything about child development, you know that if you talk about sexual education to little children, you're not teaching them to masturbate. You are teaching them to know their boundaries and so on. But I don't want to be defending this. I think it's kind of self-explanatory that this was a manipulation. Anti-gender trainings. These were apparently quite hilarious, and we now know that they were because some liberal journalists infiltrated them. And there were several really cool articles in Newsweek written by people who attended such trainings. What really lifted my Seoul was that they were attended by like 3 to 4 people, most of these trainings. So it wasn't really a mass movement, but it was planned as a mass movement. Local governments were picketed, gender education was pushed out of schools, teachers were targeted. This is an example of a flyer, and I didn't have to like Xerox it, I just downloaded it. And I thought that was really interesting, that they had this technology to create these easily printable, very colorful materials that feature those shiny-eyed children threatened by gender. Only we know how to save our children. Nobody will do it for us. You can see how this is mobilization for violence in the name of saving the children. And anyone who knows about the history of Jews or the history of gypsies will tell you, well, this is typical pre-pogrom talk, right? What were gypsies accused of routinely before they were attacked? Kidnapping little children. What were Jews attacked for? Kidnapping little children. Now it's the gender people. So when I saw this stuff, I got a little scared, because besides being a gender studies person and a mother, I also happen to be a Jew, so there we go. Here's some more images. Here's Beata Kempa, Stop Gender Parliamentary Committee. Doesn't she look lovely here with all these ties? And here's Father Oko. And the last time I saw Father Oko, not in person, but in image, was when a drag queen was singing a love song with his picture in hand. And it was really fun. It was really weird. I picked it up from the floor. I should have brought it with me. It's like, because she tore it. It was like a love song, like, you love me and you betrayed me, and she has this wonderful second dress, he, she, whatever, and then she tears the picture. But you can see why. Like, he has this incredible intensity about him. His lectures are very popular because they are very entertaining. Like, these are not, he doesn't do academic lectures about gender. I'm trying to be funny here too, but I'm nowhere close to him. Because it's fire and brimstone. And because he really gives in these lectures the details of those horrible sexual things that those perverts do. And I really can't come close. But it includes the things that they put into things. And he gets really excited about it. So he is really prime material for camp, and he's been picked up. I was waiting for this. I was really waiting for drag queens to pick up Father Oko. They're not dressing up as him yet, but they're singing love songs to him. So it's really going somewhere. By the way, it's funny, but it's not all funny. One of his most recent lectures was at Warsaw University. Warsaw University gave this guy its main lecture room. Right? So that it gets a little scary if you happen to be a person trying to do gender studies at the same institution. Here's a demonstration. Keep your hands away from our children. And this is in front of a Toruń magistrate. And the point is, I think, that they want a ban on sex education in schools. And any kind of equality education. At this point, by the way, the teachers' unions started protesting. Like they really made some really, I would say the teachers' union in Poland was the most sensible response. Like they said, this is persecution, this is discrimination, we want protection. Right? They weren't saying, we will explain what gender is, like if you only listen. No, they were saying, we want laws. But it didn't work. Instead, what worked was more and more of these posters. Stop sexualizing our children. Here's some other images. There were also some big marches, but these are just pictures I happened to get. Enough destruction of family. Stop gender because it's a utopia. I kind of like this. Yeah, I commiserate with this. Okay. Gender, conference, and gender. Okay. Phase 2. Like, when we finally stopped explaining and saying this is a misunderstanding. Oh, and I forgot to tell you the weirdest example of the liberal response, and I signed that one, I'm kind of embarrassed by it, was the letter of the Women's Congress to guess who? Who would the Women's Congress in Poland write a letter to in their deep concern about attacks on gender? The Pope, of course. So they wrote a letter to the Pope, basically saying, "Dear Pope, we love you, and won't you help us, please, because these bad priests are doing these horrible things to us, and we are sure you don't know about it." Do you think he answered the letter? No, but there was one radical feminist whose name I know, but I won't tell you because she wrote it anonymously, or she actually signed it as the Pope. She published her response in Zadra magazine, which is a radical feminist magazine in Poland, and I should have quoted it, it's really funny. She was basically saying, "Dear Polish feminists, I really appreciate your letter, but maybe you should notice that I'm the head of the most misogynistic and traditional organization in the world, and that I really want you to go to hell." And so she goes on like this, quoting the Bible, and so she says the Pope. So we had this interesting internal conversation. Anyway, so enough of that. We're now in phase 2, new perspectives, broader contexts. Very slowly, we are discovering that this thing has a history. And the history goes, as I said, to 1995, but the decisive foundational document comes from Pope Benedict XVI, his address on the occasion of the Christmas greetings to the Roman Curia. If you want to download it, be my guest. Well, not my guest, the computer's guest. It's a very interesting document which shows that Pope Benedict XVI has actually read some Simone de Beauvoir. He did not understand much, but he read her. And I have a longer quote somewhere, but I'm just going to read you a shorter one. And I'll be happy to put links to these various documents on the Krytyka website if they want it. So there's a famous saying of Simone de Beauvoir. Here's the quote, the Pope quoting Simone: "One is not born a woman, one becomes so." And the Pope then goes on to quote in French, "On ne n'est pas femme, on ne devient." These words, says the Pope, lay the foundation for what is put forward today under the term gender as a new philosophy of sexuality. According to this philosophy, sex is no longer a given element of nature. The words of the creation account, here it's very interesting how God gets to be polemical with Simone de Beauvoir, serious stuff here. So the words of the creation account, male and female, he created them. You see, Simone de Beauvoir is wrong. And we know because God says so. So these words no longer apply, says the Pope. No, what applies now is this. It was not God who created them, male and female, hitherto society did this. Now we decide for ourselves. Man and woman as created realities, as the nature of the human being, no longer exist. And I told you I really tried to be serious about this stuff, and I kind of feel sorry for the Pope at this point, like seriously sorry. If you really think that gender is the end of the world, and you happen to live in the modern world where gender is all over the place, you're in trouble. And frankly, the Catholic Church is in trouble right now, right? Because even for people who believe in God, it is fairly clear that gender is a social construct. Like, we see it all around us. Right? Some people wear dresses, some people wear trousers, some people wear wigs, and some people don't drive cars like in Saudi Arabia. I got to explain this to my son today, that was really fun. And he suggested that he would like to bomb Saudi Arabia. I said, this is not a good idea. We are not the sort of people that bomb countries because they have different ideas about gender. Anyway, my point is here that, the Pope in his polemic with Simone de Beauvoir, he uses like the heavy duty stuff, God, but he's clearly in despair. This is not the Pope is not saying Simone de Beauvoir is wrong. He's saying Simone de Beauvoir has destroyed our civilization. That's what they're saying. And if you really take it seriously, that our civilization relies on a strict distinction between the sexes as conceived in Genesis, right, whatever, 2,000 years, no, more, 5,000 years ago, then you're in trouble because things have changed a little bit since Genesis. And so the Pope, and of course, Pope Francis is in trouble because he cannot really say Benedict was wrong, right? But he cannot really say Benedict was right either, because he's a different kind of Pope. And so he's not writing letters to us, but really so. Okay, so this is where it starts. And so it doesn't start in Poland, and it didn't start yesterday. It's an older thing. We're reading these materials, we're analyzing them, we're comparing them. We come across two ladies. One of them is German, I think, maybe Belgian, Gabrielle Kubi. She is a celebrity in Germany with the Catholic Church there. Her book has been kind of condensed into a little booklet, and it's distributed all over Catholic parishes in Germany and Belgium, and I think France to some extent too. Marguerite Peters is the one who got translated into Polish, and her book is actually in circulation in Polish churches. It's called Gender, the Threat to Civilization, really exciting book. And this material, once you read this material, you realize that this is a political project, right? It's not just a campaign in Polish schools. This is a big international political project that has to do with reproductive rights, with violence against women, with sexual minorities, and that gender is really just a single word that encompasses the horribleness of all these liberal ideas. It's a strategy. It's a broader political strategy that happens to have had a very big explosion in Poland. It is connected in Poland specifically with ethno-nationalist mobilization, which now, for the first time, has explicit Catholic Church support. There were always some priests that supported some radical right-wing politicians in Poland. But in 2013, this thing becomes much more obvious, especially Solidarna Polska, which is not much of a party, but they were getting really explicit church support. And I suspect that the price they paid for this, maybe willingly, maybe not, I don't know, was engaging fully in the anti-gender campaign. This was a deal, right? The church was supporting the right-wing parties, the right-wing parties were attacking gender. Right-wing journals, Gazeta Polska, which is I think it's a daily, is it? Yeah. Of the kind of right-wing PiS Kaczyński circles. Fronda, which is a Catholic fundamentalist, supposedly intellectual journal, increasingly popular. You can see it on the web. And organizations such as Koliber, ONR, Młodzież Wszechpolska, these are all ultra-right-wing organizations, as well as some parishes and a lot of Catholic seminaries. This was really a campaign that had a lot to do with education. Right? They were trying to stop gender equality education. The key events, which I increasingly thought were the real context for this, were not so much the pedophile scandals, which coincided, and there was a very strong link initially, but there were political events. The burning of the rainbow in Plac Zbawiciela in Warsaw. You all know what the rainbow is, and you know the story behind it, right? That happened November 13th, 2013, and there were efforts to rebuild, and it was burnt again, and so on. The electoral success of the right-wing radical Janusz Korwin-Mikke, especially with young voters, which is a very interesting question, why so many young people are voting for him and his party. And they want to do things like take the vote away from women. Right? So, and you get women voting for them. So it's an interesting phenomenon. Okay? Mobilization of radical pro-life movements. And this mobilization took on a new form at this time, the form namely of civil disobedience. I don't want to get into the detail. You may have heard this if you were in Poland at the time. There was a very famous and much debated document called the Declaration of Faith, which was signed by thousands of Polish doctors, including dentists, interestingly, and they promised they would never ever perform an abortion. And I'm really thankful that my dentist will not perform an abortion. Jokes. The point is they basically said that their faith was much more important than patients' rights. And this is because faith and God is above human law. And this is the point where it is not funny anymore, right? When you get Catholic fundamentalists telling you that laws are really not for them because they have a higher law that they can obey, and that the giver of that law is God. And you wonder, what is God going to tell them next? God has been known to say weird things to people, and some of these people have been armed in history. So I got a little worried. The celebrity of this stage of fundamentalist Catholic mobilization in Poland was Professor Bogdan Hazan. gynecologist who is also an obstetrician, who is also the head of a hospital in Warsaw. And he refused to provide abortion services to a woman whose fetus was dying basically in a horrible process. I don't want to get into the medical details. It was really horrible suffering that she was going to, and the child, it was a wanted pregnancy, and the child was basically disintegrating in her body and died 2 or 3 days after birth in terrible pain, and she was not granted an abortion. Now, this happens in Poland occasionally, that doctors will refuse to give an abortion. The point was, he didn't just refuse, he refused on behalf of the hospital. In other words, it was a moment politically where the so-called clause of conscience, clausula sumienia, was no longer something that protected the rights of an individual, say a deep believer in the Catholic dogma concerning religion, like a doctor who doesn't want to give an abortion. It was suddenly a collective thing. The whole hospital had a conscience. And so a woman who happened to need an abortion in that hospital could do nothing. There was nowhere to go, right? Interestingly, this case became the focus of a huge debate in Polish media, and I thought people would take the side of Hazan. Like, I became really pretty hopeless at this point. But it didn't happen. Most media were on the side of the woman, and I think that the empathy that this kind of horrendous suffering evokes really trumps this religious fundamentalism. So I thought that was kind of good, right? She got some sympathy. She still didn't get help, medical help, but Hazan got fired. And he was fired by Hanna Gronkiewicz-Waltz, who is Warsaw's mayor, president, I guess president of Warsaw. And she also happens to be a Catholic fundamentalist. But she was decent enough and liberal enough at this point to believe that, well, enough is enough. So that was an interesting case. But why am I saying all this in the context of gender? Because it was really happening at the same time. They were using more and more radical political and legal tools to limit people's rights in the area of reproduction, at the same time as they were demonizing gender as the source of evil. Now, 2 more slides, and I really will shut up. How does this thing work, this campaign against gender? First of all, as I said earlier, it relies on a deliberate and persistent conflation between gender, sex, and sexuality. Gender studies rely on keeping these things apart. You cannot sensibly talk about gender if you think that all these things are one thing. They're not. One is about cultural significance, history, customs, beliefs. The other one is about physiology. And the third one is about sexual orientation, who you sleep with, who you desire. Now, these things overlap in interesting ways, right? But they're not the same thing. And the debate about gender, the anti-gender campaign was saying, it's all the same to them. Anyone can desire anyone, and anyone can become a woman or a man at will. And they don't want to change your children's sex too. Like, it became this idea of confusion. Everything is one thing, and one thing is many things. And our civilization is clearly collapsing. Right? If you start with confusion, you end up with confusion. And confusion is scary. All efforts to discuss social roles of men and women, as well as social disadvantages and rights, were presented by the anti-gender campaigners as a mere smokescreen. Like, they say it's about violence, but what they really want to do is sexualize your children. Right? And whatever you say, they say it's about equal pay, but what they really want is for your 5-year-old little girl to masturbate. Right? And it really doesn't matter what you say. The response is always going to be, but they are perverts, right? The role of the child in danger is really absolutely central to all this. And I've suggested earlier to you that this has a history, and that this is a history of ethnic cleansing campaigns. That this is that basically telling people that their children are in danger is the easiest, surest way to get them violent, right? To instigate violence. It is also the easiest way to make people scared, right? Because People are extremely vulnerable in their parental roles. It is also, Elżbieta Korolczuk has argued, the only way in Poland to get people politically active. It's very interesting, and this is a phenomenon that has been studied by sociologists in the region. This is a region where people do not vote, and you would think in new democracies they would vote, but they don't. This is a region where people don't believe in democracy. This is a region where people would rather not pay taxes. This is the region where trust is very low. There are studies of social trust down in Poland. You compare us to Scandinavia, it's pretty bad. Like most people in Poland, you ask them who you trust, they say, my mom. Do you have any friends? No. Right? So we really don't have a society here. But if you tell people their children are in danger, what are they going to do? They're going to get together. They're going to get angry. They're going to get organized. And this is really the only massive organizing that's been going on in Poland in recent years. Parents, angry parents. Your children are in danger. Have you heard about this? I don't see many parent-looking people here. Yeah, anyone has a kid 5 years old? So you know about ratujcie maluchy?
No.
No?
No, not the Polish words, but about the phenomenon.
Okay, so there's this phenomenon of massive organizing of parents to save their children. What do children need to be saved from? Going to school at the age of 6. And it's really horrible. Now, the scare around this was so bad that I actually signed, and I told you I signed 2 really stupid things. So this is the second stupid thing. The first one was a letter to the Pope. This thing I also signed. Do you know why? Because everybody in my preschool signed. And I thought if I didn't sign, like my little boy would lose his friends. And his life already sucks because his mother is a feminist, right? So I thought, okay, I'd sign, okay? I also kind of believed them, like that there must be something really bad about these schools. And my kid was born in December. So I'm not telling you this because I want to, tell you what a good mother I am or what a bad mother I am. I'm trying to reconstruct the way people think when they are shown these tearful, images of these tearful children. Like, who wouldn't be moved? Like this little girl, these gender people want to do something to her, you want to help, don't you? So this child in danger thing really works. And, I was thinking this must be a Polish thing. Blonde little children, they really look Polish, but actually they're not. It's exactly the same in Brazil. You go to Brazil anti-gender websites, they're the same. America, the United States, guess what the gender people want to do? They want to change your children's sex. It's not a big campaign. In the States, it never really got very far, but it's there. And they're using images of blonde little girls and blonde little boys. Okay, oops. So the child in danger is absolutely central. Parents are being mobilized. In France, interestingly, Muslim parents. There was an SMS campaign by the anti-gender folks in France. Thousands of SMSs were sent to Muslim parents to tell them that their children are in danger because these horrible liberal schools in France want to deprave their children. They used the word depravity. They didn't say that there were sex change operations happening. Probably we believe, but there's this kind of vague idea they want to deprave your children. So, but this is a whole other issue, how ethnic and religious minorities figure in all this. And well, this is obvious by now, but I think it needs to be stated again just to make sure. The whole campaign relies on a single all-powerful enemy. Like you could try to make 5 different arguments against abortion, against sexual education, against gay minorities, against efforts to stop violence against women, but you see, you're already getting bored when I list all these things. It's much sexier to say, gender, it wants to kill you, right? And so this all-powerful enemy located somewhere in New York City, that's like where the headquarters of gender are. It is said to be everywhere. It has infiltrated the UN, it has infiltrated the EU, it is on all levels of education and wants everybody to masturbate. It is aggressive cultural Marxism, it is like Nazism, it's like communism, it's a new dictatorship, these are all quotes. It's a form of terror, it's a form of censorship. I found that really moving, like they can't shut up and they're being censored. Okay, and of course it's an effort to eradicate the family. Now, there has been a number of efforts to explain this phenomenon. I've had hundreds of conversations. I'm trying to list just the most interesting hypotheses or the most interesting diagnoses. One, I'm going to be very brief here. Gender has replaced the Jews. This was argued by Zuzanna Radzik, who is a very interesting philosopher and theologian and a Catholic woman, very, very troubled by this, progressive Catholic. She says it's basically the same as pre-war anti-liberal, anti-Semite efforts of the Catholic Church. It's simply, they changed the words, the structure is the same. Eugeniusz Smolar, who was a prominent Polish philosopher and pro-democracy sort of figure, argues that this is really part of a much broader conflict, which at heart is a conflict about modernity. Gender is a figure for collective fears about change and the West. And he has suggested that the source of this and the organizing power and the funding is to the East, and that Putin might have something to do with this. And I've heard the same from Hungarians. And the Hungarians really know, because their democracy has been all but dismantled. And there's clearly Putin is funding some of the most radical right-wing efforts. So it has been suggested that headquarters are there. Magdalena Radkowska-Walkowicz, in an interview given for Krytyka Polityczna, you can read the whole thing on the website, has argued, and she's an anthropologist, very interesting, that this has something to do with reproductive technologies, not abortion, but more like surrogacy, the really new stuff, the stuff that scares people, the stuff about choosing your baby's eye color, the stuff about that really brings high technology and reproductive shit and motherhood together. She says, gender is now part of a debate about the nature-culture frontier, a key site for cultural anxiety due to biotechnology. Anti-gender campaign is an effort to stop this. What they want to stop is the scary stuff, the sci-fi stuff, right? And I think this is an interesting analysis. You'd have to read more about it. Mirosław Traczyk, who is a sociologist who studies the nationalist movements, and he really studies them, like he did participant observation, and some people actually say he really is a neo-Nazi, but I don't think he is. I read some interviews with him. I think he's just a really interesting, slightly right-wing intellectual. Anyway, he says this is really part of class conflict. It's not gender that is really at the core of this. Gender is just a word. What is really going on here is that this new nationalist extremism in Poland is a masculinism driven by frustration. You have thousands and thousands of young men who do not have a chance to get a job and start a family. And they feel humiliated. They feel unmanned. And so who is doing it to them? Capitalism? No, it must be gender. You see how it works? How class conflict gets transposed onto an arena of gender. This new manhood rooted in patriarchal values, he says, and he has wonderful quotes from them about this. This new manhood is nationalistic and patriarchal and aimed at those horrible gay people, right? Now, my argument, since I'm the mother feminist here, is that the whole campaign might have a grain of truth to it. Now, it's not a nice thing to say when you're a feminist, like we're at war, we're supposed to be saying we're all right and you're all wrong. Well, I actually think they've got a point. And the point they've got is that gender equality discourse in Western Europe and at the United Nations level and at the EU level is extremely individualistic. It's focused on opportunities for individual women. It's focused, it's basically a bourgeois discourse of progress, of autonomy, of freedom. And this excessive individualism of gender discourse is partly at fault. Because what happens is that people have pitted feminism, gender equality against ideals of community, family, and motherhood. The question is, can we reclaim community, family, those good worm things for equality? can we argue that equality is a family value? And I actually think it is, right? So, and I made this a little tiny little slide because I don't really believe this is possible, but my ideal at some point was that maybe we can get beyond the polarization and actually talk. Like maybe, you know, Catholics and feminists can talk, and maybe we can find some Catholic feminists in Poland. It's not really happening. Okay, conclusions, I think I've said it all. It's not a local phenomenon. It's not an accident that it's happening in Eastern Europe much more strongly than it ever did in France, Spain, or elsewhere. Putin might have something to do with it. Eastern Europe is also especially vulnerable. And finally, you know, it's fun to crack jokes. Some of this stuff is really campish, but we should not underestimate our opponents. The anti-gender campaign has nothing irrational or ignorant or erratic or desperate about it. It's brilliantly planned, it's very well funded, it draws its power from anti-Western resentments and collective anxieties, and there are very good reasons for those anxieties. And those reasons are called neoliberal globalization. That stuff is real. Gender is just a kind of projection. The source is real. People have things to be terrified about. Okay.
About people who are in a hurry, go, and people who want to talk, stay. Another moment now.
I was already talking.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation. It's very interesting, very informative. Well, since the title of the lecture was our poem for beginners, we would like to know also the other side, which is because you focus so much on the satire of these weird movements, but there's also the other side, which is like what Polish people are doing to counteract this weird movements. And since because we have heard that there are parties like Your Movement, or that are trying to do something in Parliament to change the situation. Oh well, I'd like to know your take on that, and I'm not sure if they're doing it. And on the other side, and on the other hand, there are some movements also around the world that are feminists within church. You know, I think this is more or less a way to see that how Poland can evolve into this. It's not a radical change, but it has to be some progressivity on this. And in Germany, there are some churches that they have women as priests. So I think that there is some more gradual approach to see how Poland can evolve.
Would anyone like to answer this? I mean, I could give you a very short answer, like tough luck. No way. I mean, I think I would really love.
Agnieszka, use my microphone.
I'm sorry. I would really love for there to be a vibrant Catholic feminist movement in Poland, but there just isn't. You know, there are basically two Catholic feminists in Poland. One is called Zuzia Radzik, I quoted her, and the other one is called Dominika Kozłowska. She's the head of the magazine Snap. They were both in that Dominican church with me, and the bomb was thrown at all three of us. And just for the record, it was just a smoke bomb. Like, they didn't want to kill us, they just wanted to scare us. So, let me stop this. The stuff that you are mentioning, the serious opposition, is typical of Western European countries. In Poland, we have a kind of liberal women's movement mobilization. It's called the Congress of Women. It's not very big. It's controversial because it's funded mostly by an employers organization, so it's very neoliberal in a lot of its
agendas. I'm part of it, so I partly identify. I think it's also the only thing that can work. The best we could do was write this pathetic letter to the Pope. I think they also later paid a visit to the episcopate. I'm sorry. There really isn't much. This is a very conservative country politically. And I don't know what you're talking about, this Europa movement. Is that the thing that Palikot and Kwaśniewski tried to do, but it imploded like 6 months ago? No, I mean, we really do have a choice right now in Poland between PiS and PO. They're both right-wing parties by Western standards. What is going on right now, and if you're asking like me, what's the hope for the left? It's probably the long lecture because I think there is no hope. But the one hope there is probably the so-called city movements, which made a pretty big appearance in the last elections. What is interesting is that they insist that they are not ideological. A friend of mine who is active in Miasto jest nasze, which is the most popular, I voted for these people, the most popular city movement in Warsaw, she put an advertisement for my latest book on her fan page on Facebook. They wanted to kick her out. Like, I'm really radical for these people. They don't want to be associated with crazies like me. I kind of understand that. If you want to get votes in Poland, you don't want to be, associated with people like me. I'm Jewish feminist, pretty bad. So, no, I mean, I'm sure there will be other more hopeful lectures. My take on Polish Catholicism is that it is much more conservative than any other Catholicism in Europe, maybe with the exception of the Irish. But Irish Catholicism has really suffered from pedophile scandals, and Polish Catholicism is going strong.
Maybe to help the other person who asked a question, I'm from the Netherlands. We almost don't have a Catholic church. We import Polish priests for the few very old people that still go to church. And I'm wondering, can you say even in Poland, secularization is on the rise? I mean, that's his answer. I mean, people just vote with their feet. They don't go anymore. You say this guy is very popular, this Janusz, this weird priest. But apparently, if you see the whole picture and the statistics, the church is losing. You actually were saying that yourself. You said the Pope is desperate, the former Pope. And you said he is right. And Simone de Beauvoir was also right. So Simone de Beauvoir is winning, and we are winning, and they are losing. And that makes them so extreme.
Yeah,
So I said a strange contradiction in that aspect of your lecture. Now I shut up, sir.
Sure, I mean, you got me on my bad day, My good days, I'm saying the times they are changing and so on. I guess I just want to suggest that they are not changing in Polish politics. The most progressive, the hope of progress that you mentioned, it just died a while ago. There really aren't any progressive forces in Polish parliament. Polish leftists are really very conservative. But you're right, fewer and fewer people are attending, are church-going, and even the church is publishing these statistics. But in Poland, the thing is that we used to have people who called themselves believers but non-practitioners. People who believe in God but don't go to church. The problem is that we have a lot of politicians in Poland who don't believe in God but go to church. And when politicians go to church, they're taking politics with them. So in a weird sort of way, it doesn't matter whether Polish society is leaving the church. As long as the Polish political elite continues this myth of there is no Poland without, the church blessing, we're in trouble. And for those of you who read Polish, there's a wonderful book out, interview with Cezary Michalski, who's one of the Krytyka Polityczna intellectuals, interviewing Palikot. Now, I don't believe in Palikot in the sense I would never vote for him again. I think he's really a dead fish in terms of political hope, but he's incredibly smart, and he's really got his finger on it. Yeah, this book really explains why it is that, regardless of secularization, there's still this incredible marriage of politicized religion and politics in Poland. What are its roots? Goes back to the 1920s, 1970s. It's a very powerful kind of ideological force in Poland. And what is terrifying is that the people who are keeping this in place are mostly atheists. They just believe that the masses need the church, because otherwise the masses, they will go crazy. So it's about political manipulation. It's not about piety of the masses.
Maybe just to ask what are feminists planning to do next, apart of this, responding to the attacks and following the discourse that is set by the other side. And also maybe from your perspective, because you put an emphasis on these socioeconomic issues, which might be more, I don't know, might open space for new alliances.
I'm an academic, so I do what I always did. I teach classes on sex and gender and American movies, and hello to my students in those classes who are here. And I do Mae West, and I compare her to Father Oko. What I think has happened is that people are increasingly interested in gender studies. I was recently in Szczecin, and they are actually opening a series of lectures. This thing actually activated a lot of interest, but it's still a niche. There's no massive response. And there cannot be, because there is no massive women's movement. So, I think we are not a political force. I would love us to be a political force, but, you try to get a grant for something, you don't get the grant, and then, there goes your activism, because you've got to make a living. This is not a time of mass movements. But there are efforts, like I can tell you the kinds of ideas and efforts or attempts that my book, for instance, has sprung up. I think there's more talk than there was 5 years ago about the way equality works to benefit the family. And I'm not saying this is thanks to me. I'm saying I'm part of a wave of this kind of talk. And I think this is really the best direction. It also happens to be the direction that I think the gay movement in America really took off about 10 years ago, and they won. You don't get rights by saying you are anti-family. You get rights by saying, we want families, like everyone else. That's why gay marriage is really completely obvious in America right now, even among conservatives. So I think this is the ideological work, but also the work in social and public policy that needs to be done. Small steps towards issues that will simply make lives easier for people. Like we need to fight for good childcare, good affordable childcare, human conditions in Polish hospitals for childbirth. I'm not saying give up on abortion. I'm saying do other stuff more visibly. Give a feminist angle to the stuff that works for the family. I'm a fan of a lot of work-life policies also, that, for instance, Irena Wójcicka is pushing through the president's office. There are lots of people doing this kind of work in various places, and I'm trying to be a part of that effort. I think that's really where the jazz is right now. Not in sexual rights, not in gender theory and Judith Butler type of stuff. It's really social policy, work-life, childbirth, childcare. But that may be my angle because I happen to have a small child and I know a lot of really furious moms, right, who are not making ends meet and who, can't get the stuff that they should be getting. But that's my angle. That's where it should be.
I have one, maybe it's an additional point, I don't know. You said that from your point of view, the feministic movement is an individualistic movement. And this is actually one which I don't agree with, because if you see the whole picture, like men and women, it might be that it makes women more individualistic, but it integrates men more into things like family business. If you talk about work-life balances, of course, if you strengthen the role of women in the economy, at the same time, you strengthen the role of men in family affairs. And this is actually why I think that everyone should support the feministic movement, because such things like, if you take Darth Vader, why is this myth so successful? Because it's about the missing dad, the lack of fatherhood or something, which is one of the biggest narratives in the last hundreds of years. And actually, I think if you can keep this, if you get it more equalized, like the standards of quotas also in the economy,
okay.
Also.
I think you are, when you say the feministic movement, you are really talking about your idea of feminism.
Of course, there are.
And I'm talking about the general direction of the mainstreamed women's rights movement in Western Europe and the United States. In other words, I'm talking about a certain social process, which a lot of scholars have argued has moved towards individualism. In other words, if you looked at feminism as a social phenomenon, and ideology also, in the 1960s, it was very clearly leftist. In other words, the things that it wanted from the state had to do with not just equality between men and women, but general redistribution. Feminism in the 60s, at the at the beginnings of the second wave, wanted to change the world. Now, and I think your definition is very idealistic, but it's also very contemporary. You're saying feminism is really about equality between man and woman. But if you think in those terms, you are thinking in terms of individuals. You are talking about what the woman wants from the man. And what I'm suggesting is that feminism should be about that. Yes, this is really crucial. And I've written a lot of stuff about masculinity, about fatherhood, about the psychology of gender injustice. This stuff is tremendous. It works for people. It's what makes people click. But as a social movement, feminism must negotiate social policy. And social policy is really about poverty and wealth. It's not about stereotypes. Right? Well, I think we have spent, I'm talking feminists. I'm not saying bad feminists and good Graff. I'm saying Graff is a feminist. Graff worried. Feminism, do something, right? I'm talking from inside of this. It's not just my argument. I really recommend, if you want to read up on this, Nancy Fraser wrote a book called, I think, The Different Paths of Feminism, or Roads of Feminism. Krytyka just published the Polish edition of it. And there's a very famous article that really started a huge debate about this individualistic trend within Western feminism. Which was called Feminism, Capitalism, and the Cunning of History. It takes some attention to read it, but it's brilliant. So basically what she argues is that it's interesting to watch, especially American feminism, which has been the dominant mode, that feminism managed to win those issues that are not costly in terms of money, right? Against gender discrimination, okay, the state doesn't have to put much money into it, you just ban certain activities. Sexism, right, as a kind of idea of certain images, but you're operating on the level of consciousness. Okay, but what about childcare? This is the one thing that American feminists never got. What about parental leave? Never happened. Well, that's because it costs money. That's because it is a challenge to capitalism. So weirdly, feminism during the last 30, 40 years worked hand in hand with neoliberalism to create this image of a woman who is dynamic, independent, free. She can have an abortion if she can't afford a child, and she can go and compete against the man. Well, but what about the people who don't compete very well, right? What about the women who actually have babies and don't have a source of income? What about the men who have babies and don't have a source of income, right? Are we talking just about the man and the woman, the abstract entities who want to renegotiate, or are we talking about social injustice? And ironically, what has happened is that the right-wingers, the conservative Christians, the conservative Muslims, all those religious people, they are saying, see what individualism got you? It got you lonely, it got you scared. Gender has done it. And I'm saying, we are at least partly to blame for it. We spend too much time, too much effort fighting for freedom and not enough for equality. Okay? A very famous book about this, or famous among the 5 feminists that I've read it. A famous book about this is Hester Eisenstein's Feminism Seduced. Really cool book that looks at the economics of this, because I'm interested in the cultural process and what happened in the academia, the books. She talks about the money, where the money went. For instance, it's much easier to get a grant, to work, to get women ready for the labor market and flexible, than to get a grant for issues that have to do with elderly and childcare. these are not sexy issues somehow for the grant givers. Well, because these are not issues that fit in the neoliberal agenda. So feminism has kind of adapted to the neoliberal agenda. It's not a conscious process. It's not like someone was sitting up there and saying, oh, now we're going to talk about strong super women in places of power, and we're going to forget about the poor. It wasn't a conscious decision, but it happened. And the rise of conservatism and the way that conservatism is embraced by so many women is a side effect of that. Of course, they're not going to deliver the goodies either. But they make really powerful promises and they scare people to death because they're saying feminism is about to get your children. Well, they now call it gender, but it's really the same. So and I say this with sadness because I'm really very, very much part of this story, and I love all the big feminist books, and I think we need to reshuffle our cards a bit. Two more questions and I'll be brief responding, so raise your hand. I want to hear some women here. Especially Eastern European women. See, quotas don't work.
I don't believe we want fishies.
Come on, anyone?
Okay.
Great, go for it.
So you said some things about how gender, the word gender, is used by right-wings, journals, and I don't know, maybe TV. But what about, I should say, not invoked medias? Do they exist in the first place?
Not what?
Do they exist, the medias that are not invoked into this
You're
discourse?
sitting in one of them, Krytyka Polityczna.
Okay, but maybe some independent medias or governmental medias that are not representing one of the points of view. So how do they use this word gender, in what context and in what meaning?
Okay, first of all, the word gender, spelled like this, came up in mainstream Polish media only in the context of this debate. It doesn't, otherwise feminists had tried to use it to further equality, but it never worked. And my books were popular, and I wrote one of the first, probably the only best-selling feminist book in this country, World Without Women. It's partly because I didn't use foreign-sounding words. I used words like płeć kulturowa. Right? You go around it. Gender sounds weird in Polish, so you can go around it. But in 2013, if I understand your question correctly, the places that were opposing the radical anti-gender campaign were Gazeta Wyborcza, who published this really decent extra, and it's really interesting. It has an article by a linguist and by a biologist, and this is not about politics. They're like using this as an occasion to mainstream some cool gender research in various fields. So I read this thing with interest, and I was really interested. Like the last page is how gender saves men, and Leszczyński wrote about some interesting and controversial theories of masculinity. So they use this as an occasion to mainstream feminist research, but also, and this is where if you want some hope from me, this is where at the time I drew some hope. Znak, Więź, Tygodnik Powszechny, and one more I don't remember, sort of liberalish Christian Catholic journals, all published extras on gender. And I didn't agree with everything they were saying, but they were basically saying this demonization of gender is really stupid. It's not Christian. And let's see what you can say about gender within the framework of Catholic theology. And it went from pretty liberal in Tygodnik Powszechny, including a really good analysis. Probably one of the best early analyses of the anti-gender campaign was published in Tygodnik Powszechny, which is a really interesting Catholic weekly, liberal Catholic weekly. Of course, the bishops think that they are the Antichrist. Like the liberal Catholic media in Poland are not accepted by the church. They're not purchased by the convents, for instance, right? But progressive Polish Catholics read Tygodnik Powszechny, and a lot of atheists like myself do too. I read it every week, and I been interviewed by it. I like these people. I don't agree with them on a lot of issues like God, but other than that, they're kind of cool. So there was, there was a lot of sensible stuff, but it wasn't the mass media. All the tabloids were saying gender will come to get your children, and the tabloids is what people really read. There were also wonderful pseudo tabloids on Facebook. For instance, there's a pseudo tabloid called Factoid. You know Fact? Poland's main tabloid. Well, there was a spoof of it. I don't know if it still exists. I just followed it when they did their series on gender, and they had a series, a kind of sensational series about a beast, a really furry beast that looked a bit like Yeti, which was being followed, and it was found sometimes in the forest and sometimes in the desert, and it was of course gendered, right? And so it was really funny, like priest such and such, age 26, had spotted gender, but then it ran away. More tomorrow. So but of course this is a tiny little niche. The real fact, the real tabloid, was basically doing things like they dressed up little children in the opposite sexes' clothes, and they had children, they had pictures. Okay. And then the next day you would read in another newspaper that actually these were pictures from a party. But fact would never acknowledge this. And I wonder, this is something I really don't know, is whether ordinary people were really scared by this gender thing. I think it has largely been replaced since then, this huge media blitz about gender, by what is now going on around the last election. So it's one of those panics that the right occasionally needs to instigate. So first we had Smolensk as a coup. Then we had gender as the international plot against our children's sex, and now we have false elections. But the gender thing lasted for quite a long time, and I think it did a lot of harm. So I would say some people did believe it. Some people were turned by it, but also some people became genuinely interested in gender studies. And I'm seeing some of those kids in my classes, and they're kind of more interested than 3 years ago, let's say, and there are more of them. Okay, we done? Okay. I asked Krytyka, and they said they would do a screening of Podziemne Państwo Kobiet, Underground Women's State, with English subtitles. So if you put your name on the list, this will be an extra meeting for this series of events, and I'm really happy all these people want to learn about Poland for beginners. Bye.
Thank you.